So now it is me talking about Neil Woodford. Neil Woodford, oh gosh, he's walking out already. I was out in the foyer there, and a man with a sort of skinhead haircut, looking a little bulky, walked up to me. I thought, Christ's sake, Neil Woodford's come to stalk me. It wasn't, actually. It's Chris Wood, the estate agent, who's doing a talk on purple bricks later. Maybe that's just because I'm a bit jittery. I have been panicking about what to say in this talk because you're taking on a guy who is an absolute giant of the fund management world. He is perhaps the biggest name in fund management. And as people often point out to me, I used to be a fund manager, bad old days when I was a crony capitalist, and I was pretty crap at it. And I'd be the first to admit that. Having been pretty crap at it and found myself in some difficult situations, I actually find myself able to think, I think, in the same way as Woodford is, because he's in a very difficult position himself. I'm quite sad that Neil Woodford isn't here. I mean, maybe that guy, Chris Wood, from who's going to work Purple Bricks, could perhaps pretend to be him. I'm sad he's not here. I would have liked to have done a two-way interview with him. I would have quite happily travelled to Oxford and recorded it. I would have gone anywhere in the country. I'd have liked to have done that. I'd like for him to try and answer some of the questions which I will be posing today. He's declined that. He's very happy to do interviews with that fellow from Hargreaves Lansdown who just asks him how brilliant you've been over the past 3 months, every 3 months. But he doesn't appear to want to do an interview with me. I think that's sad, because I've got some questions which I just think he can't answer. But I want to put this in context. You read when he launched his new investment management business 3 years ago about how the guy was a genius. If you'd put £10,000 into Neil Woodford's funds in 1996, it'd be worth £1.5 million or 150,000 or whatever, a huge number. And I thought, surely they're skewing the statistics. He can't have been that good. Well, actually, he was that good. In fact, he was better than Warren Buffett. Now, I tried to find a chart. I tried to rig this chart. I tried to find a thing saying, no, it's all a myth. It's all a myth. But the reality is that when he was at Invesco, you have different units. This is probably, it may be a little bit inaccurate to a couple of %. But this is Woodford against Warren Buffett between 1996 and the point at which Woodford left Invesco. And you can see that Neil Woodford was actually better than Warren Buffett. Now, you don't get that to be that good by accident. I think there are a few contributing factors which are in Woodford's favour. When they started in 1996, the market wasn't a terribly happy place, so Woodford gets to start his fund right at the bottom. Not quite right at the bottom, but pretty much at the bottom. So he benefits from that. There are one or two other things he benefits from, but you can't take it away from him. When he was at Invesco, Woodford was absolutely brilliant. And you must give him enormous credit for that. Since then, a little bit different. This is going to embarrass, you may not be able to see what this is. This is going to embarrass my next guest, Mark Slater. But this is comparing Mark Slater with the main Woodford fund. You'll see, actually, Mark Slater, this is since the launch of Woodford's main fund, which was 3 years ago. The Woodford fund is the pink one. Mark Slater is the orange one. The FTSE All-Share is the green one. This is since launch. And you see, he's rather lost that Warren Buffett knack. But he is at least ahead of the All-Share since launch. He's way behind Mark Slater, obviously, but he's ahead of the All-Share, and he is ahead in absolute terms. This is since launch. If you take it on a 3-year view, it's rather less pretty, and he's bottom of his sector pile. If you take it on a 1-year view or a 3-month view, he's down, and it's really very horrible indeed. I think a bit of the initial outperformance could be down to what is the Woodford effect. When Woodford launched his fund, he raised an enormous amount of money, £10 billion or something. He raised an enormous amount of money and then proceeded to take very big stakes in companies. Now, I suppose Woodford can take a big stake in AstraZeneca or Imperial Brands and probably not move the share price by much. But as he was building up stakes in rather smaller companies, it was quite clear that there was a double Woodford effect. Not only is Woodford buying in the market, so that as he builds his stake up over time, that pushes the share price up, but there was the other effect, that at least when he launched, Woodford had an absolutely slavish following in the financial press. This was nothing to do with the fact that Woodford Investment Management spent a vast amount of money advertising in the financial press. It was a pure coincidence. But the following would say, Woodford's buying this. And duly, if that appeared on a Sunday, on Monday morning, shares in this would go up as the readers piled in. So there's a little bit of a Woodford effect at the beginning, which I think helps him. But latterly, it has clearly gone a little bit wrong. Is this down just to bad luck? That would be one interpretation. We all have bad luck. We all make the odd bad call. No one gets it right all the time. Is it down to bad luck? And is it anything more than just picking a few bad stocks? Well, no. I think that would be a highly charitable approach to say, just Neil Woodford's had a touch of bad luck. You see, I mean, the markets can go through difficult times. And again, to Woodford's credit, he has gone through 2 major market turns and called them brilliantly. In the dot-com era, Woodford, like Warren Buffett, didn't fill his boots with dot-com stocks. He knew they were all jokes. They went through the roof, and people said, that Woodford, he's lost his touch. Warren Buffett, senile old git, he's lost his touch. And for a while, they looked like schmucks. Then, of course, the dot-com stuff crashed, and they looked like heroes again. But he called that one right. The banking crisis as well. Woodford was not exposed to banking stocks in the way that many fund managers were. He called that right. So could you just say, oh, it's a bit unlucky, he's a bit unlucky, he's the wrong sector, things will turn? Well, I don't think you can. Because round about... Oh, sorry, before I go on, I should just point out, the fund we saw in the previous one was Woodford's Equity Income Fund. That's his best performing fund, his flagship fund. Here we see something called Woodford Patient Capital Trust, which is a closed-end fund listed on the AIM Casino at 100p. It's now 85p. It's been a complete disaster. So it's done far worse since it launched than more or less anything. It has been an outright disaster. We'll come to WPCT in a while. This is a story of both funds. But we go back to this issue of, has Woodford had bad luck? Around the middle of last year, he started making some very dramatic calls about the stock market. This article is actually from early December, when he made a very, very strong statement. The stock market is a bubble. It is going to end badly. But he was making those calls from the summer of last year. Why was he doing that? Because his funds were underperforming. And his argument was that he was invested in good, solid British defensive companies which were a bit unloved because really people wanted to own shares in online, blockchain, cannabis-related, whatever. The rubbish was going up, as you would guess, in the frothy top of a market, and Woodford was arguing he was going to be underperforming at the moment, but it would come right when the market corrected. I actually happen to agree with him. I think his analysis from last summer tied in with my own. I'm a naturally pessimistic, bearish person, but I think for all sorts of reasons which readers of Share Profits know, I would have agreed with his analysis. The problem is that whilst Woodford said the right thing, he didn't actually do the right thing. If you take the view that the market is going to take a major correction, then whatever you own, it's going to suffer a little bit. When the stock market falls by 20 or 25%, the sort of numbers that you would associate with a bubble bursting, it is not as if any share is immune. It is a wave, and whatever stocks you own, whatever sector they're in, they're the cork on the wave. They will go down. So if you take Woodford's interpretation of the market, what would you do? I personally would be selling stocks so that I would be building up my cash reserves. I would be getting out of small, illiquid stocks, unquoted stocks, private companies which are not generating cash and are going to need refinancing, because when the stock market tanks, getting your company refinanced is very, very difficult. And I wouldn't be exposed to the sort of industries which are going to do particularly badly if the stock market corrects. So that's what you would expect Woodford to have done. But of course, he actually did completely the opposite. Last summer, Woodford was sitting on net cash in his fund. As of today, we don't have the March statistics out yet. They seem to be rather delayed, and I can't think why. I think the reason they're delayed is that they're going to have some real horrors there in terms of redemptions, but also this issue of debt. Neil Woodford's flagship unit trust has got debt today. It's incredibly unusual. I can't remember any other OIC unit trust having debt. But Woodford has gone from having net cash and a reasonable cash balance last summer. He's used all of that up. He's predicting that the market's going to tank, and he's spending all his cash on buying new shares. In fact, he's gone and borrowed money to buy more shares. And this is a man who thinks the stock market's going to fall, and it's going to fall sharply. It gets worse. If you look at the sector weighting in his fund, you can see the sector weighting as at last month. It's not that dissimilar to where it was last summer. He's got 40% in financials. Think how financials fared the last time the stock market corrected. It wasn't pretty. He had 20% in health. Now, health can be defensive if you're in companies like GlaxoSmithKline with its yield. But if you're in tiny little biotechs, which are reliant on funding in the market, when the market dries up and it's impossible to get secondary financings away, those are the sort of stocks that get battered. Woodford was heavily invested in them, both in the financials and in healthcare and biotech. He had way over sector weightings. If he was just matching the market, he had far less, but he was way overweight. He was also overweight in technology stocks. Again, most of the ones he was invested in were loss-making companies, and he was overweight in them. So his sector positioning was completely and utterly at odds with what he was predicting for the market. It gets worse. He had, over the summer, almost 8 or 9% of his portfolio in unquoted companies. Unquoted companies, you can't get rid of them if you need cash. You can't get rid of them at all. You can only sell them if they get a listing, which happens rarely, or if you find a trade buyer. And worse still, if you look at the unquoted companies that Mr. Woodford has invested in, nearly all of them are loss-making. They're burning cash at an alarming rate. So what do you know is going to happen? There are a few things in life that are certain. Death, taxation, and the fact that if you've got a private company which is burning cash at an alarming rate, it's going to have to get a refinancing, which is going to be incredibly difficult if the stock market crashes, because people are going to be moving away from risky options. So did Woodford sell down his unquoted portfolio? Well, oddly enough, no. He actually increased it. So this is not bad luck that Woodford has got a problem here. He's called the market, I believe, correctly, but he's then avoided doing what would be the logical conclusion when it comes to his macro call. By September last year, this was already unraveling. One of the problems which Mr. Woodford has is that if you run a UCITS, a unit trust, there are certain limits which your ACD, the actual owner of the fund, and which the FCA will impose on you. If you start breaching those limits, you get into all sorts of problems. They can say you stop getting your management fee. For a bloke like Neil Woodford, who earns £7 million a year, that would be painful. They could, in extremis, fire you from managing your fund. By September of last year, Neil Woodford had the problem that the overall portfolio, his quoted companies, was falling in value with the market, due to the market and some individual bad calls, but also he was starting to suffer redemptions, both institutional money and also IFAs taking their clients out, individuals taking their clients out. They were spooked by what was going on. The net result was that he found that the percentage of his equity income fund, which was held in unquoted stocks, was up to 10%. And it was rising. It's not that the unquoted stocks were going up in value, au contraire. It's just that he was suffering massive redemptions and the quoted stocks were falling in value. How did he get around this? Well, there was no buyers for his unquoted stocks. He should have known that. We're going to be in a bear market. It's impossible to sell this stuff. So what did he do? He quite simply transferred unquoted stocks from his unit trust into Woodford Patient Capital Trust, the closed-end vehicle. Woodford Patient Capital Trust gave quoted stocks to the unit trust, and the unit trust got rid of the unquoted shit into WPCT. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but it does beg a few questions. The biggest question is, at what price do you transfer? And this is where we come from. Is Woodford unlucky? Well, I think we've established he's not. Has Woodford made investing mistakes? I think we can say he has. To the issue of, is Woodford doing something which is borderline, perhaps arguably a little bit naughty? I don't know if Neil Woodford's got a lawyer in the audience. The issue here is that you're transferring a large amount of unquoted stock from the unit trust to the investment trust. At what price do you transfer it? Woodford was transferring it at the last price in the unit trust, which would have been a valuation based on the last fundraising. Now, you could say that is fair, but it's not really fair. Woodford says there were independent valuations which said it was fair, but it's... Oh, is that my son?
It's his lawyer.
OK, right, OK. Hello, Joshua. Sorry, Joshua, for once you shut me up. Right, is that fair? No, of course it's not, because the unit trust was a forced seller. It had to sell the shares. It had to sell them quickly, and it had to do so in order to stop getting in really hot water with its ACD and the FCA and absolutely everybody else. It was a forced seller. Now, if someone is a forced seller on one side and a reluctant buyer on the other side, surely the reluctant buyer can really screw them on price. But that didn't happen. It's never happened. There should be real questions asked about WPCT by its so-called independent directors. Why on earth were we paying that price for all this unquoted rubbish? That continued all the way through to December, by which time 80% of WPCT was in unquoted stock. And it had its own limit, which happened to be 80%. It was no longer a buyer, and that has been the position. Now, what has made the position of Woodford worse is that he's had some almighty bad calls with quoted companies. We have Capita, we have Provident Financial, we have AA Group. Big companies where he has got it wrong. Now, we all get it wrong, but there is a certain arrogance here. On Capita, there's a quote from Woodford from January of this year. The exact quote. The shares yield over 7% here, which suggests that some investors fear a dividend cut may be required. With a new chief executive now in place, clearly that eventuality cannot be completely ruled out. But having met John Lewis during the month, we're reassured that decisions around the capital structure and dividend will be informed by a clearer long-term strategy. 2 weeks later, the dividend was scrapped altogether. There has been a series of these blunders where Woodford has invested in a company, a problem has emerged, and he's responded to that by buying more shares at a lower price. And then another problem has emerged, and he's averaged down again. He has been having a knack of catching falling knives. Now, you might say, well, we all have the odd mistake with big companies, but that is the question about Woodford's decision-making process is made more pertinent by what appears to be some very erratic small-cap calls. Now, I'm indebted to a colleague who won't reveal his identity. He writes as Cynical Bear on share profits. If you go to the share profit stand, you can get a flyer which will give you access to the whole website for Sunday only, even if you're not a subscriber. And you'll be able to read a series of about 100 articles written by Cynical Bear looking at some of the quite ludicrous decisions taken by Neil Woodford with regard to small-cap investment. I bring you just a couple. There is a company called Industrial Heat. Woodford invested £32 million in that. Industrial Heat is involved, I don't quite understand, it's to do with cold fusion, I believe. And the basic premise here is that if it can change the laws of physics, it might have a commercially viable product. 32 million quid Woodford put into that, other people's money. There's another one here which Cynical identified, a company called Thin Film. It's got provides a smart electronic label for products that can allow you to read the label in a store with your mobile phone. Now, you would have thought you have existing PIN codes and barcodes and price things. It is, of course, a completely unnecessary product. Just to give you an idea of how Woodford, which has put tens of millions of pounds into this, in 2014, this company had sales, don't know how, of $3.5 million and burned 22 million of cash. By 2016, sales 3.8. They're up by 400,000. It burned 42 million of cash. And in the first 9 months of last year, sales up to 4.7 million, and it had burnt 62 million of cash. So that's $160 million sent to money heaven in 3 years and 9 months. Quite amazing. Woodford has backed that time and time again. There was a company, RM2, which we talked about in the Bears session up last year. Woodford has backed this heavily. It has burned money at a prodigious rate, and he's just had to bail it out. He now owns 70% of the company. The business model here with RM2 is, at the moment, when you're transporting stuff around the world, you use wooden pallets. It costs less than £5 to buy a wooden pallet. Some people, you know those things which you stack your goods on? Some people use plastic pallets. It costs about £20 to buy a plastic pallet. RM2 produces high-tech pallets, which will cost you £60. The advantage here is it has a chip inside it, so if your pallet is stolen, you can find it. No, I think you've worked out the flaw in the business model here, but Woodford has put tens of millions of pounds of other people's money into it. The question you have here is Woodford has a very, very small team of researchers at his firm, and also there is a culture, clearly a culture of hero worship. He's the king, the others are minnows. So how rigorous is the due diligence process on the investments the companies do? Most fund managers would employ far more people than Woodford in order to do discounted cash flow models and to go and do some market research on the pallet model market and other things. Are we sure that happens? Now, the next thing we want to talk about is how naughty has Woodford been? And we have the issue of valuations. We've already addressed the problem of transferring unquoted shit from the unit trust to WPCT. That looks to me incredibly suspect. But we have other issues. I want to bring you to a company called Benevolent AI. This company, and go through the numbers, in the past 2 or 3 years, it had a first fundraise which valued it at 40 million quid. Lansdowne Partners put in 4 million quid. There was then, shortly afterwards, another fundraise with a valuation of 80 million quid. Another 4 million quid put in. Then Woodford got involved, and 40 million quid was raised on a valuation of 150 million pounds. I hope you're keeping track. Nearly all of that came from the Equity Income Fund, 34 million. WPCT put in 1 million. The remainder was put in by a company called Upshur Smith Laboratories, which had bought the business of the CEO of his previous business. Then what happened? Just a couple of months later, there was another fundraise. The valuation there was 1.1 billion. Absolutely nothing had happened to justify that uplift. And guess what? The people who put in just 6 million quid were Upshur Smith and Neil Woodford. The net result is that, perfectly legitimately, Neil Woodford was able to announce a massive uplift in the value of his benevolent AI stock in both his funds. Do you think that's really justified? The only people who agreed to the 1.1 billion valuation are to people who backed the previous funding round on a 150 valuation. They get to look like total geniuses just by risking a few quid more. Is that really legitimate? But of course that happened. As it happens with benevolent AI, things have got even more interesting now because it had been such a successful investment that it became one of the largest investments in the unit trust. And Neil was up against his unquoted limits. So what did he do? Well, firstly, he transferred 50 million quid's worth of stock from the unit trust to WPCT on the 1.1 billion valuation. Great news for the unit trust, an absolute disaster for WPCT. And then a couple of weeks ago, he appears to have written down the remaining holding, which the unit trust had in benevolent AI, to zero. He's changed his shares to being some sort of preference shares. Maybe he'll be able to unconvert them later. But effectively, he has given away his shares for nothing. Does that mean that WPCT revalues down? I suspect not. But it seems odd. He spent all this money and now he's writing them down to nothing. It doesn't do much for valuation. There was another one the other day, Oxford Nanopore. This is a biotech company. It's been going for years. People I know who know the company well question its science, but that's irrelevant. Who cares about that? Oxford Nanopore, Woodford, there was a funding round 18 months ago. 3 people played a part in it. IP Group, WPCT, and the Woodford Unit Trust. It would seem to be a reasonable funding route. Move forward, and there was a new funding announced a couple of weeks ago. 100 million quid put in by some Chinese investors. They know what they're doing. At a valuation of $1 billion. That seems to be much higher than the last funding round. So what happens? IP Group puts out an announcement, and it announces that it's got an uplift of 11.74%, or what it was, 11.28% on its stake from 2016. Well done. It hasn't revalued the stake. That seems to me particularly relatively prudent. I don't personally believe the valuation of Oxford Nanopore, but that's another matter. IP Group has been prudent. For the Woodford things, it's a bit different. The Woodford Equity Income Fund announced a valuation uplift of just 2.5%. That is to say, it had already revised upwards the valuation of Oxford Nanopore in its portfolio, therefore lifting its net asset value, its funds under management, just because it thought things were going to happen in the future. It was counting the jam tomorrow. But at least there was still some sort of uplift, 2.5% in the value of its holding. Woodford Patient Capital Trust, it actually had to cut the value of Nanopore because this is uplifted by 20% already in order to keep its net asset value going up. So it had already discounted all the good news and even more good news. How on earth can that be prudent? Now, I'm running out of time. I think I've raised questions about valuations within the fund, transfers within the funds, and also about Woodford's inability to drink his own medicine in terms of macro calls. What happens next? Well, WPCT, the investment trust, the stated net asset value is 87p. But that's nearly all this unquoted rubbish. Do you really believe the net asset value? We just had the unit trust write its benevolent AI shares down to nothing, give them away. Do we really believe that 85p? I don't believe it. So there's a real problem there. But there's another problem. The company doesn't have any cash. WPCT's liquid holdings are pretty illiquid. It's quoted holdings. It's impossible to sell its unquoted rubbish. It hasn't got any cash. It's actually got gearing, and it's right up against its gearing limit. Yet we know that all the unquoted companies are going to be having funding rounds coming up because they're all losing money. What will happen? Well, in the worst-case scenario, they go bust, they can't get the funding, they don't have Woodford cornerstoning them anymore. In the best-case scenario, other people come in and provide the funding at a much lower level because the cornerstone investor isn't there, and Woodford is diluted to oblivion. So that doesn't look terribly good. What about the equity income fund, the flagship fund? Well, we await the data for March. I am not surprised that it seems to be getting later and later each month. I can bet you that he suffered big redemptions. He's also going to have suffered a big fall in funds under management simply because things have gone down. He's been forced to do things he thought he'd never do. Neil Woodford has been in love with AstraZeneca since Adam was a boy. He was swearing all last year how this was the crown jewel in his portfolio. He'd never sell it. Well, guess what? He sold all his AstraZeneca in March. Or was it February? He had to do because that's a liquid position. He could get out of it. It'd be very hard for him to sell his 28% of Purple Bricks, but he can sell his shares in AstraZeneca, and he needed that, A, to support rights issues and cash calls at Provident Financial, Capita, etc., and B, to fund all those redemptions. You're going to be seeing more and more of that going forward. What could really kill off Woodford is if there is another big blow-up, Imperial Brands or something like that. One of his other big positions causes a real problem. Or if there's a regulatory blow-up, his problems with the unquoted limits in the fund, the supposedly independent directors at WPCT asking the questions they bloody well should have been asking for all of last year. If there's some sort of regulatory blow-up, that would be disastrous because that would mean that the scale of redemptions we've seen so far would be nothing. They'd be flooding in. Then you have the problems with his unquoted limits. Then you have the problems about cash. The supposedly short-term, only in emergency borrowings would then become just a feature of the fund. All of those things could really snowball. I suppose Woodford could trade out of it. If the market goes through the roof, he will benefit, he will trade out of it. But it strikes me that in the worst-case scenario, he is just one big accident away from this really blowing up. In the best-case scenario, facing those sort of problems, would you trust Neil Woodford with your money, or would you give it to the next speaker, Mark Slater? I know what I'd be doing, and it sure isn't Woodford. Thank you very much. Before you go, Woodlarks are at the back. I've given them 3,000 quid today. They've got buckets there. The least you can do is give them £5 each before you go out. I'll see you after the tea break. Thank you.